Hi, everyone. Just wanted to say hello. I'm so glad you could join us. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy. My name is Kristina Torres, and I'll be your moderator today. Our webinar is presented by NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and I'm really glad you could join us on this Friday. As we take a few more seconds to let everyone log in and get settled, let me take care of some quick housekeeping. This session is expected to last roughly about an hour. We'll have a formal discussion, but we'll also want to address your questions, anything you may have. So while your microphones will be muted during the discussion, please share your questions in the Q&A tab, and we will do our best to address them as time permits. And I also want to let you know that the presentation is being recorded and will be posted soon on nlgja.org. So look for it there and we'll get it up as quickly as we can. So with all that out of the way, I am excited to turn to today's discussion, which spotlights the work of this year's Excellence in Journalism Award winners. Today, we are speaking with Excellence in Documentary Award winner PJ Raval for their documentary Call Her Ganda. We're also speaking with Excellence in Book Writing Award winner Robbie Corey-Boulet for the book Love Falls on Us, a story of American ideas and African LGBT lives. So PJ and Robbie are going to share their thoughts about their work and their ideas about the importance of documenting international LGBTQ plus experiences. And as part of our conversation, we'll also talk about why and how they developed their award-winning projects and why they believe the projects that they do and others do like this are important. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Kristina Torres. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a national board member of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and have been very honored to serve as this year's committee chair of the 2020 Excellence in Journalism Awards. So with all that out of the way, I will stop talking and we'll allow PJ and Robbie to introduce themselves. PJ, if we could, let's start the introductions with you. Tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So I'm PJ. I'm a documentary filmmaker based out of Austin, Texas. You know, a lot of my work does look at stories from the LGBTQ plus community. I'm also very interested in stories from the Philippines and specifically the Filipino diaspora in the United States. And I'm excited to be here.
All right, well, thank you for joining us. Robbie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Thanks, first of all, to the association for organizing this and for having me. I am speaking to you from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where I'm currently the correspondent for Agence France Presse, the newswire agency covering Ethiopia and the African Union and a few other countries in the region here in East Africa. Prior to that, I spent about 6 years in West and Central Africa working as a freelancer, primarily for the Associated Press and a few other outlets, but also researching and reporting the book that has been honored by the association.
Well, thank you also for joining us, especially from Ethiopia. So we'll get right to it. Let's get started. In both your projects, you kind of documented these very intimate moments in people's lives, both kind of as they happened, you know, and as they remembered them. And while you both work in different mediums, obviously film and then long form writing, in both your cases, these moments involve an incredible amount of detail and emotion and really characters. You have protagonists kind of swirling in and out of the narrative. So PJ, let's start with you. How did you decide, you know, or come to decide you wanted to tell Jennifer and her family's story?
I'm not the type of person who's, who kind of believes in like fate or something like that, but it kind of just came together. I was in 2014, I was invited to go to Manila in the Philippines to screen some of my previous documentaries. And when I arrived, it was shortly after the crime had been committed. So Jennifer's story was definitely starting to filter into the news. It was definitely in my social media feeds, but it was largely, a lot of the reporting was very much just factual, as a lot of the details were kind of being released, right? Like, so at first, and even at first, a lot of the reporting was incorrect. You know, it was a man dressed as a woman was found dead in a motel room, you know, and eventually you could even see the media starting to correct itself and actually use the word transgender or trans woman.
Right, and you include some of the reports, they misgender her.
I do, yeah.
Sounded like Western reports.
For sure. And I think that was largely just because this was my experience hearing it too.
Yeah.
But it was about, you know, but on that trip, I ended up on a panel for LGBT rights. And I happened to be alongside attorney Virginia Suarez, who is the, you know, the counsel of the Laude family. And it was on that panel that I really started understanding the huge significance of Jennifer's story, and also kind of a more look behind the scenes. And so that is kind of what made me start connecting to the story in a different way. Specifically, Virgie shared with us a clip of Nanay, which in Tagalog means mother, so Jennifer's mother, where you could see her really impassioned, you know, basically pleading with everyone to say, please pay attention to this. We need, you know, we need justice here. And I think that seeing that kind of raw, you know, that kind of raw emotion being recorded in a press release, I think was really powerful. And the other thing that struck me was, coming from the United States, it was around the same time that I had been thinking about maybe doing a project about gender variant kids and parents. You know, I was just very interested in that, and thinking about a lot of friends of mine having children, and children who are gender variant, and you know, and vice versa. And then here was a case of a woman in the Philippines coming from what we would consider an uneducated background, you know, from a small remote area, and just very clearly saying, my daughter, my child, yes. There was no misgendering, there was no, you know, it was full acceptance of Jennifer's identity, and that she was really going to, you know, take on a foreign superpower. So I thought there was something really inspirational and admirable about that. So that is kind of where I started thinking, like, you know, maybe as someone, as a queer Filipino American, like maybe this is something that I can start looking at specifically from my own kind of, you know, unique perspective of someone, you know, who has grown up in the United States, now standing in the Philippines, and kind of understanding what a little bit more the dynamics between the US and the Philippines. And then in short, kind of at the end of the day, I just decided, you know, maybe I should make the documentary that I want to see, right? Something that I've never seen about this, really thinking about, you know, the colonial past and present between the US and the Philippines. And just even the fact that as an American citizen, I can go into the Philippines and feel like I can make this documentary, and, you know, being able to use my resources to do it. So, so that's really what kind of did it for me.
Well, and just really quickly, because I want to make sure everyone knows, and let me jump in here. Caller Ganda is on Amazon Prime right now, and I encourage everyone to if you do have a Prime account, even if you don't, it's readily available for viewing, and it's stunning. I think it gives a new perspective for something you just don't consider. But just quickly, for folks who haven't seen the film, just a quick synopsis of what your documentary is about.
Sure, yeah. So the documentary follows 3 women, basically, as they are pursuing justice over the death of Jennifer Laude, who is a trans woman in the Philippines, who was killed in Olongapo, which is the port city, and also the home of the largest offshore US naval base. And Jennifer, unfortunately, was killed by a US Marine. And so the film follows these women trying to get the Marine into court, and even recently hit the news cycle again because the Marine was recently granted an absolute pardon by President Rodrigo Duterte, which interesting enough, I'm actually kind of like updating the current film to kind of include all the way up to date. Yeah, a little bit, just to you know, go into kind of where the story, you know, leaves off. But for me, the film is also a look at the long-lasting effects of US imperialism in the Philippines.
And we're going to get into that, and I also want to get into that update, but give us a second. I want Robbie to give you a chance to jump in. And Robbie, your book kind of addresses this really complicated relationship between African LGBTQ activists, and it's almost both American foreign policy, you know, as PJ says, the imperialism, but also really Western donor policies, you know, folks who give money for certain things. And there's often, they're not in sync, or it's not complementary to the activists who are on the ground and the reality they face. But tell me a little bit about how you decided to pursue that for the book.
Sure. So I first started reporting on these issues when I was based in West Africa working for the AP. I was living in Liberia in December of 2011, which is when the Obama administration announced that it was going to make promoting LGBTQ rights a specific element of its foreign policy. And you might remember that Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, went to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and made this landmark speech saying that gay rights are human rights and human rights are gay rights once and for all. And it was an announcement that made a big splash internationally. And so as I was working for the AP, I was encouraged to look for reaction from the region, because the region is widely seen as one that is pretty repressive for sexual minorities. And when you work for a wire service, the focus is naturally on people who are traditionally considered to be newsmakers, be they heads of state or religious leaders. And a lot of the reporting that was getting picked up in the stories that I was filing emphasized this conflict between an ostensibly progressive American policy and leaders in the region who were reacting negatively to it and saying that this was unacceptable to them, and their societies were completely intolerable to sexual minorities and would remain that way. And I was very frustrated that that seemed to be the only perspective that was getting any kind of attention, because at the same time, by virtue of the fact that I was living in the region, I was befriending sexual minorities and gay activists and people who were living very full lives and were accommodated in various ways by their societies, even when they were living under legal systems that criminalized their very identities. And so one of the reasons I turned toward longer form journalism and then eventually writing this book was that I wanted to present a fuller picture of what life is like and what the effects of policies that, even in the case of this US State Department policy, are supposed to be beneficial to sexual minorities, the mixed effects that they can have for people living on the ground.
Right. Well, the interesting thing to me, and you know, much like PJ's film, let everyone know, Robbie's book is available on Amazon. You can find it through independent booksellers. Also a very good read, and I recommend it. I enjoyed it. You focus on 3 countries: Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Liberia. You know, and as PJ has kind of 3 central characters in the documentary, you have several. You have Lambert in Cameroon, you have Brahima in Ivory Coast. These are people telling their stories, and you're kind of looking at the issues through their eyes. You have Patrick and Karishma and Fatou in Liberia. How did you choose kind of who to focus the story through?
It was a good question. I mean, partly it's a function of access to tell the stories in the way that they need to be told. You have to win people's trust, and the people who were ultimately featured were the people who agreed to participate in the project in a way that would allow me to cast a very intimate look at their lives, sometimes in ways that I can only assume was uncomfortable to them. I also wanted to capture the variety of experiences. I think often, especially in Western media, Africa is treated as a monolith, and people describe—
And you point that out in the book, yeah.
Yeah. People talk a lot about quote unquote African homophobia. And so that's partly why I was really keen on featuring Cote d'Ivoire, because that's a country where same-sex sexual acts have never been criminalized. There is a fairly open and tolerant scene, underground in some respects, but certainly more open than I think many outsiders would expect in Abidjan, which is the commercial capital and the country's main city. So yeah, I guess it wasn't like I had certain boxes that I wanted to check when I was figuring out who to spotlight in this work, but I did want to capture the range of environments and the various ways that people were accommodated or not accommodated by the societies they live in.
Well, I want to get a little bit, there's a point there I want to get to, and it's the idea of sourcing and trust, right? You know, both of you have, as I mentioned earlier, have such intimate looks. You know, PJ, you have Jennifer's mom, who just broke my heart because she's so, she's the emotional center of the documentary to me, you know, and the family, you know, fight, and through the lawyer and through Meredith, the journalist, who's also helping document this. And Robbie, we just talked about the sort of cast of characters you have, but I want to hear how you both approach kind of, you know, this idea that, Robbie, for you, and then forgive me, it's, you know, someone coming in, a Westerner, an American, someone who, you know, who is Caucasian, who's coming into, you know, these very specific sort of communities. And then PJ, it's also the idea with, you know, and part of this is in your documentary, the idea that you're American, and then you have the Philippines, and, you know, even Meredith at some point is said, oh, well, you're American, you don't get it, or you don't fully understand. I mean, how do you both kind of handle that? How do you win the trust and say, no, I can tell your story accurately and compassionately, and you can trust me? PJ, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Robbie brought up a great point, just the idea of trust, right? Like you have to earn trust of the subjects of, you know, of your project. And I think in this case, you know, since I had served on this panel with Fergie, I think she had already seen my films. She had heard me speak about kind of my ideas. And she really was crucial in connecting me to the Laude family. And so kind of what we did was, you know, I gave them some of my previous films. I wrote them a little statement saying why I would like to meet them and, you know, why I'm thinking about doing this. And I think, you know, that is what was key of kind of earning the trust, was I already had the trust of Virgie, who was their attorney. But what I will say is it was, you know, I was really honored that they said yes, because I think at that point, they hadn't allowed any cameras in to follow them kind of behind the scenes. Like they had been doing press releases, things like that. But the idea of someone following them around, I think A, was a new idea to them already. And then B, was also something that they really were not interested in doing with other people. So with that said, I think I was able to earn their trust though, because they had seen that I had made previous work that, you know, had featured maybe stories that were untold, but also, you know, I basically wrote to them saying, I kind of see myself in this unique position where I do have, you know, the privilege that I carry as an American, but also as someone with a Filipino, you know, with parents that come from the Philippines and someone from the LGBTQ plus community. Like I understand these issues from a very, you know, personal point of view, but also, like I said earlier, I really want to make a film that I wish I could have seen that really makes me understand all of this. And letting them know that there's a lot that I don't know. And that's why I am making this film, is for me to understand it. But I think, you know, in the documentary world, at least, there's a lot of conversations around extractive filmmaking, right? Like this idea of filmmakers coming into an area where they have very little history or connections to, telling a story, you know, capturing a story, bringing it out to the world, and really what good does that do for that community, other than highlight it, showcase it, maybe puts it even more in more danger, you know? So I was very aware of that and thought a lot about it. So for me specifically, since in documentary, we tend to work with a lot of collaborators, you know, whether that be producers and camera people and sound recordists. And so for me, it was from the start, I was very, you know, I was very intentional about finding a local producer who lived in the Philippines, who, you know, was there, that was always going to be collaborating with me to make sure that I wasn't, you know, assuming something or taking something out of context. And so the very first person I brought on was Kara Masanak Alakpala, who's an amazing, you know, television journalist, also in her own right, and documentary filmmaker. And you know, since we are talking to, largely people interested in journalism. Kara's mother is actually Letty Masanuk, who, is the editor of the Philippine Inquirer, who was one of the former editors of the Philippine Inquirer and was someone known to really defend freedom of the press.
Yeah.
So I kind of already knew that just through mutual friends, Kara was going to be, amazing with this. And so from that point on, I, made sure to bring on, my whole producing team was Filipino American, Filipino Canadian, and all of us were making these films because we had our own kind of personal stakes in it somehow.
Right.
And I think seeing that also maybe gave confidence to the Laude family and everyone else in, who I was filming, that maybe, I was not trying to be extractive about this, and I was trying to, really tell the story from the inside. Yeah, but with that said, the last thing I will say is that it does get tricky, right? Because as I mentioned, I am coming from the United States, and even my financial resources are much greater than so many of these people here. The amount of money that I'm going to pay a camera person, that money could pay someone in the Philippines for months, So it is something that, we always have to think about in terms of, how we're negotiating this and making sure. Yeah, and then actually one more thing, which is kind of the last thing that comes to mind, is specifically in the film, Jennifer, a lot of Jennifer's friends who, knew her, who we interview, work as sex workers. So that was something that I had to really think about too, like even the act of me filming them, having them meet me somewhere to tell their story and openly talk about the kind of work that they're doing and the life that they're living, I have to really think about their safety also. So that was something that was, so again, thinking about trust, that was something, is I had to really ask them to trust me with being able to share a story and their story in a way that they feel like they're not going to, compromise their safety in any way.
Well, and I would have to think not, and so they don't feel exploited.
Exactly. Yeah.
In this
Exploited, but also not targeted. Be very clear about that, right?
Yes.
And especially this film goes into an administration change from Aquino to Duterte, and Duterte obviously has very specific mandates and missions on how he is targeting very specific communities.
Right.
So there was a lot of thought and concern that had to be placed around that.
I can imagine. All right, we're going to get back to that really quickly, Robbie. Before you go, everyone in the chat, we have links to both PJ's film and Robbie's book. So if you need a link, you want to browse now, maybe browse after the webinar, please do look and click and hopefully purchase. That would be great. Robbie, let's get to you. As we mentioned, sort of the trust and the source building, how did you approach that?
Well, PJ talked about security, and those concerns really have to be at the forefront of your thinking when you go about this kind of project. Especially in the beginning, I had to be very aware of the fact that I did not understand the landscape, and there were real knowledge gaps in terms of my understanding which kind of behaviors or which kind of exposure could really put somebody at risk. In 2 of the 3 countries that I was working in, same-sex sexual acts are criminalized, and prosecutions stand up with very flimsy evidence. So it's a huge risk for anyone to participate in any kind of reporting project that's going to identify them or shine any kind of light on their communities. In all of the countries, though, I benefited greatly from the fact that there are some very brave and prominent activists who have, for various reasons, decided that the visibility is something that they can withstand. And so they were natural points of entry for me in introducing me to other people who I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. It's a bit of a complicated line to walk, because those people, because they are very visible, are sometimes benefiting from greater protections from Western embassies, and also they're people who have told their stories many times over, and they're very important perspectives to have, but I wanted to have produced a work that was richer and also included voices of people who were not comfortable being out and proud activists and challenging anti-queer voices in a public way. And in terms of ultimately winning over the people who featured, I think people have different motivations for getting involved in this kind of project. I think in Liberia, it's more of an activist-centered section of the book, and I think many of the people who are highlighted thought that the exposure could be good for them. It could connect them with donors. It could bring some attention to work that otherwise would have gone ignored. So it's important for me to, I mean, I think that is a possibility and it has happened in some cases, but it was important for me to manage expectations, you know, that being featured in this book published by a very small press is not necessarily going to change your life. So that was one thing I had to keep in mind. In Cameroon, I think the people who are at the heart of that section were really in line with my reporting goal, which was to illustrate the complex effects of these policies that are ostensibly undertaken for their benefit, whether it be by a progressive administration in Washington or by human rights organizations. They were people who had really lived that over many years and felt that those stories weren't being told, and some of their criticisms of Western activists and actors weren't getting any kind of attention. And then Côte d'Ivoire, the man at the center of that section is somebody who is not really affiliated at all with activist circles and didn't necessarily have a political point to make, but was rather somebody who had only come out to one other person besides me, and I think benefited from the interview process, just being able to have a platform to talk about these issues, to talk out questions he's had about his sexuality and his identity and where he fits in a society that, while more permissive than the other two countries, still is a difficult place to be a sexual minority. So a range of motivations from the people I spoke to, and it was an interesting mix of expectations to try to navigate as a journalist.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned Brahima from, I'm going to say Ivory Coast. You say it in French, and it's better than I would. But it's, you know, you mentioned kind of this idea that were some, the Liberia section, you know, that maybe they hoped they could get more attention, more donor funding, and kind of help them that way. Brahima was this conflicted character and very personal, his story. It wasn't about activism so much as family, and kind of how he was navigating that in the community and location, geography, right? Which city he was going in and how it worked out there. I was kind of surprised that it was just very intimate sort of piece of the book. And I mean, it sounds like he trusted you enough just to tell his own story, not the community story, it was his story.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was honestly the most rewarding reporting experience I think I've ever had in any context. And one of the things that I say about journalism is that you're always trying to get people to say things that they've never said before, to say something that even they're just thinking out in that instant. And for Brahima, that was the entire experience. I mean, we did dozens of hours of interviews on topics and subjects that he had never talked about, even to the person who introduced us, who was the one other person he had spoken at all about the fact that he slept with men. And yeah, I would have to ask him why, honestly, he decided to participate, and I'd be interested to hear what his answer is a few years after the book. Well, the book was published a year ago, so a year after the book's out, what were his motivations initially for getting involved? But I'm incredibly grateful that he did.
Well, and good. He had a great evolution, and so that's what I love seeing, is the intimacy. So taking a step back, we've kind of been talking a little bit about policy. This idea of foreign policy plays a big part for both of you in the stories you tell. And PJ, in the documentary, it's this idea of the colonized versus, you know, the colonizer, or formerly colonized versus the colonizer. I think it was the attorney who mentioned that for the family. It's how do you kind of handle that? It's, you know, you're trying to tell a very intimate story, but it's this huge, broad context that's going on about foreign policy and, you know, in PJ, in your case, the military, and kind of this complex relationship, you know, with the VFA and the agreement they have for the U.S. military to be there in the first place. PJ, let's start with you. It's a very kind of, to me, a line tightrope almost you have to walk.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to place context, right, upon the story. And not only the history of things, but maybe thinking about the perspective of where you're watching it from, right? Or where you're reading it from in terms of your own kind of, knowledge and perspective. I think specifically for me, part of the reasons why I am interested in documentary film is it's an opportunity to kind of humanize a story, right? Like I do think people hear, oh, someone was murdered, right? Or someone was found dead in a motel room. And that might just land in terms of a piece of information and not really understanding the context behind that, the consequences of that, how that truly impacts someone's life, how something like this happens. And I think ultimately, sharing these stories from a personal perspective, right? Someone being able to actually put a face and a story to a piece of information that you have, I think is really incredibly powerful, right? In creating some kind of empathy and some kind of understanding. And I think, I think on the surface level for someone to say, oh, well, what kind of connections do I have with a trans woman in the Philippines who, was, found dead in a motel room? It's like, well, watch this film. You will understand what those connections are.
You're very intimate in it, in that you have crime scene photos. I mean, you can't ignore it unless you look away, which
you can. And and at the end of the day, Jennifer was someone's sister, and Jennifer was someone's daughter, and the idea of loss, and the idea of feeling powerless, and the idea of being caught up in some kind of military agreement going beyond what you see as your own person, your own story and your own justice there. I think those are things that are relatable to anyone, right? And so I do think being able to give that the chance for an audience to experience that and understand that is what I'm trying to do with these films, right? And kind of to Robbie's point, the idea of, when you take the story and share it, like, what can it do, even if it's coming from like a small press or just a few screenings, I think every bit helps, right? Because there are certain stories, when you hear them, you watch them, you read them, you can't take those back, right? They change the way that you perceive the world from that point onward. And for me specifically with my film, I wanted to, create a little bit of a haunting effect. Like, you are haunted by this story, and I'm hoping that you will be haunted enough to never forget it, and to always think about it, and always think about what actions you can take to change it, right? And to prevent another story like this happening again. So I do have a slight activist agenda in there, whether or not it's the thing guiding it, but it's a hope that I have, right? In terms of making my work useful, or I don't want to say useful, but to contribute to what others are also doing, right?
Right, and you're letting them also speak to it. It's not like your voiceover saying, this is what is going on and this is what you should feel. You're following this in real time, where the family and the mom and the sister and other relatives, and then the lawyer, and then Meredith, the journalist. I want to get to Meredith in a second, but it's as it happens. It's actually them telling you, well, this is what we feel. We feel oppressed. We don't feel this is fair. We feel overlooked. We feel, and to a degree, I mentioned exploited. They feel exploited with this broad foreign policy that no one seems to have control over.
Absolutely. And I want to give a glimpse of how a policy like that affects people in a day-to-day, living situation, right? And this is exactly what we're able to do. But last thing I'll say is that I do feel like I'm able to capture these stories and present them, and give them a platform to share them, right? You're right, I'm not giving them a voice. They have a voice. It's just whether or not they have a platform to use it and to be heard. And so part of my, for me, part of the filmmaking is to do that. Right. I think their voices are incredibly powerful, and I want the world to hear them, because they inspire me greatly and move me greatly.
All right. Well, Robbie, how do you navigate that? You mentioned, the change in President Obama's policy at the time, and kind of how that created this flashpoint, between sort of this homophobia and then the activists on the ground trying to deal with that plus everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in terms of my positioning in relation to the subject matter of the book, as a white American male, there are clear limits to the extent to which I can understand in a real visceral way what these people are going through, the people who I'm interviewing in West and Central Africa. On the other hand, as a white American male, I am very steeped in some of the discussions and debates and conversations that are shaping US foreign policy, specifically with regard to LGBT issues. A lot of the people who were involved in devising the 2011 policy shift are people whose political careers I was aware of. I was also aware of how the debate in the US had changed so dramatically from, say, the Bush administration to the second term of the Obama administration in terms of engagement on LGBT rights overseas. And so I think that put me at an advantage when it came to explaining what these policies meant and some of the assumptions that might be shaping them, the way that Americans see Africa and talk about Africa in the media, which I'm a part of, and also just broadly in policy circles in Washington. In terms of things that I hope the book could accomplish, I was really hoping to disprove the notion that activists in West Africa didn't exist. I mean, I think a lot of sexual minorities, stories focused on sexual minorities from Africa tend to paint a pretty desperate picture of people who are trying to flee, whose only hope is seeking asylum elsewhere, and who really have no hope for living full lives in their home countries. And that didn't square at all with what my experience as somebody who's living in the region. And so I wanted to give a voice to those people, or rather, that's a formulation I kind of hate, actually. Not give a voice to them, but to amplify voices that were already on the ground doing really important work. And then on the other hand, I wanted those people to be able to criticize in a real substantive way the effects of these well-meaning interventions that were coming from outside.
I got you. You talked about media, and obviously, Robbie, that you're a journalist. You've steeped in media. You've lived in Africa for a while. PJ, when we were talking last week, we were chatting, and you said, "Well, I don't view myself as a journalist. I think self-documentarian or documentarian is kind of where you went with that." But one of your main protagonists is a journalist. It's her also reporting the story and digging and talking to community members and talking to some of the women who are sex workers who can kind of talk about what's going on, the dynamics, the economic ramifications of what's going on. Tell me a little bit about how you balance that, because what you told is a very true story that as I said, centers on a journalist kind of reporting on the work.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Meredith Toulousan, who is a journalist, writer, now also memoirist, who has a book that recently was released, and also, was born and raised in the Philippines, is a trans woman, is albino, is someone who lives in New York, and so Meredith started reporting on Jennifer's story before I even started making this documentary. And so when I was so when I was introduced to her, it was through some friends who knew she was on the ground already reporting, and so I connected with her, told her what I was doing, and asked if I could interview her and maybe follow her around. And if Meredith were here, I'm sure she'd share the story of how I basically said, "Oh yeah, I just want to speak to you for an hour on camera," and that turned into 2 years of me following her. I knew that. Maybe she didn't know that when she first sat down for the interview, but I already had it in my mind that maybe that's where this could go. But what was really great about that experience is it allowed me to follow someone as they're investigating and asking all the questions on camera that I have also, but not doing it on camera myself. And along with that, being able to follow someone from a perspective who might be looking at this from an even deeper or more unique perspective, because Meredith also identifies as an openly trans woman. So, so there's a lot of things in the film too, where you see Meredith really thinking about her own position and her own history and whatever opportunities she's been given and whatever decisions she's been able to make that have given her a path different of what Jennifer's was, right? And her acknowledging that fact that through a different set of circumstances, she could have been Jennifer, right?
Yeah.
Or she could have been someone more closer to that position, right? And what are these choices? What are these opportunities that someone like Meredith was given that allowed her to not go down that same kind of story, right? Or that kind of path. So yeah, so it was really, for me, a really fortunate meeting that I had with Meredith, where this blossomed into her becoming, you know, one of the subjects of the films. Because and reading her reporting, which is really great. It's very insightful and very well written. You know, thankfully she let me use it in terms of recording her reading it and me able to use it as narration, right, of what's happening in the film. So we're hearing a live, you know, kind of reading of her reporting while we're seeing her actually do it. And for those who, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh, I was going to say, you know, so in the film, I think we feature 2 of her articles, and then there's some photographs we obviously see of her also, because she does a lot of photojournalism. But for those of you who have seen the film, or maybe will see the film, towards the very end of the film, Meredith actually goes to, you know, New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is where the Marine who killed Jennifer is from. And she's going there thinking about reporting, right? Like this idea of thinking about maybe creating a news report there or some kind of article. And so we follow her going there, and she herself is not even sure what she's going to find. And so since there was not an article that was written, I asked her to just read out her field notes that she had been taken. And for me, I really loved it because it almost felt like some kind of poetry or prose, like really getting into the perspective of, you know, maybe what a journalist does on site, you know, and kind of the ways that they're thinking about it. But what I will say is, you're right. I don't consider myself a journalist. I consider myself a documentary filmmaker. And for me, there is a very clear distinction I make with that, in the fact that I'm not trying to be objective at all. Like, I mean, if anything, I'm the opposite. I'm being very subjective, right? I'm telling you from the perspective of something that I witnessed through the stories of these very particular people. I'm not interested in telling the story through the Marines' perspective, for instance. And because of that, I'm not afraid to use music, right, to make you feel a certain way and shoot it in a way that makes you angry, or, you know, edit in a way that, you know, makes you sad. Like, I am playing to your emotion. And for me, that has always been a strength of documentary filmmaking, because when people start feeling something and learning something together, then that is really, again, giving them the opportunity to experience maybe what this person did, right? Because this is how they felt probably during it. And I think, again, it's just that crucial step of having, you know, of creating some kind of empathy there.
Right, empathy and connection.
And connection.
Right, right. How long did it take you, I'm gonna say start to finish, and I know that that's kind of nebulous, but how long did it take you to do this project?
Yeah, I filmed for about 2 years, about 1.5 to 2 years. So by the time I decided to fully jump in and make this film, to probably me standing on a stage premiering it, saying like, this is the film, was probably close to 3 years.
Wow.
Which for me is very quick because other films that I had made were much longer. So, but it was something that I, you know, really wanted to get out there very quickly.
Right. And there is a time element, which we'll talk in a second. Robbie, how long did it take you for the book?
Yeah, again, it's a complicated question to answer. I started reporting on these issues in 2011. The book came out in 2019. So an 8-year process, but it was not a project that I was working on exclusively. I was also freelancing and just supporting myself through wire service work and other work that I was doing that was not associated with the book at all. I had a fellowship from the Institute of Current World Affairs, which is based in Washington, from 2014 to 2016, which is that was the period when I did the bulk of the reporting. And then after that finished, and took about a year to write, which is kind of in line with what I expected. I mean, this was my first book, so there's a learning curve there. I think ultimately, as frustrating as working on something for that amount of time can be, and not even necessarily knowing for large stretches of it if you're going to finish. As frustrating as that can be, I think it also benefited me to see these stories as they changed over time. I've often, because I work on breaking news a lot of the time, you're kind of capturing isolated moments, and people say things that they may not even mean the next day, let alone 2 or 3 years later. And
Right.
the experience of reporting this book was very different in that I was able to track those views as they evolved, and then also was able to identify which stayed consistent over that period.
Right, and it's not the views evolving as it also is sort of policy evolving. You both, kind of are going from Obama one administration to another administration, the Trump administration, and you have moments in both your works where that comes into play. Robbie, for you, how did you make a conscious decision that, okay, I'm gathering string, I'm working over this a number of years, as you say, it's not just an instant interview or instant reaction, to say, I need to make sure that's included?
Yeah, I did. So I left the region in 2016, a few months before the election, and then obviously the election happened, the outcome was what it was. And I applied for some grant money to go back to Liberia to report a lot of that section, re-report a lot of that section there, and see how that community specifically had been affected by the change in administration, because the ties between Liberia and the US are so close. The other two countries are more in the Francophone sphere of influence. And it was super illuminating. I was really glad that I did it. Obviously, Hillary Clinton had, in the years leading up to the election, identified herself with this issue and taken it on as Secretary of State, and then on the campaign trail. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for her candidacy on the part of African activists for that reason. But I will say that after the Trump administration came to power, it became clear that regardless of the rhetoric that was coming from the White House or from the upper echelons of the State Department, the machinery of the State Department is not necessarily something that can be transformed overnight. And so the effects were a bit more complicated than you would expect. And then the other, even more important point is that the fact that these communities were able to continue with the work that they were doing highlights the extent to which they're not dependent on outsiders. They are, in fact, doing their own thing. And while the outsiders, like the administration in Washington, can influence that, it's by no means decisive in terms of, shaping their story.
Got you. And PJ, the change in administration is almost crucial to your documentary. It's a key part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of what I wanted to do with this film also was just kind of, think about a historical timeline of when this is happening and connect it to a cycle, right, that keeps happening, right? And in this case, we have, President Rodrigo Duterte, who gets elected, and he very much gets elected on a platform saying he's going to be tough on America, right? American troops are going to be out of the Philippines. We're no longer a colony, yet even in the film itself, you see him bowing down to American foreign policy. And when Trump visits, in addition to unleashing a quote unquote drug war, in the Philippines. So what I wanted to show with that was also, how does something like this happen, is because it's institutionalized, right? It's basically the government itself writes it into policy in terms of treatments, and then they're enforced by these elected leaders. Whether or not the leaders are saying that they're going to change it or not, they're adhering to it. And that is what's incredibly frustrating, for these activists that I'm following, and for the Laude family, because they really are subject to policies that, that greatly affect them, that they have very little say in.
Right. Well, something I want to talk about is kind of related to that is this idea that you made, when we've talked about it, you made a very specific choice that this is the family story to tell. This is the community story to tell. It's not the American story to tell, right? And yet
Correct.
you have this, the U.S. Marine, who's a white man who's really also at the center of the story, but you felt pressure to include more of him, or tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, for me, if I were to make a film about the Marine, I think it would do an incredible disservice to this story, because for me, that's not the story. For me, the story was never whether or not the Marine is guilty. Pemberton himself, had in his testimony had admitted to, the violence that resulted in killing Jennifer Laude. So that was never a question. And I do feel in the process of making this film, I did come across some pressure to look at that, because I do think, especially looking at it from a US Western lens, those are the stories that we usually hear, right? Like the story of a killer. Why did they kill? Why did they, what made them murder someone, right? And in this case, I didn't want to do that, right? I don't want to make it about the colonizer. I'm going to make it about the colonized, right? And use it as an opportunity to hear about the stories from their perspective and how they're reacting to it. And their, the barriers that they're facing, trying to even seek accountability for this crime. And for me, that really was the story. And I think if, I think if it were to go the other way around, the other thing it risks doing is further supporting violence towards trans people, to be quite honest, because then what we're saying is, in this story that we've heard, in this crime, in this situation, what's important for us to look at is who did it and why, right? And I didn't want to go that route, right? I feel like that's also just another, another form of imperialism, to be quite honest. To go into the Philippines and tell it from a US perspective and try to, somewhat justify why, someone did this crime is truly, truly a form of imperialism right there.
Okay, Robbie, did you feel pressure to in your book, either do a certain perspective or ignore a certain perspective, or report on certain things and not report on others?
Not in the course of working on the book, but one of the main motivating factors for me to undertake the book to begin with was the fact that when I was writing on these issues, writing news stories on these issues for Western media outlets, I was often really just casting Africa writ large as a foil to ostensibly progressive policies that were being implemented in the US. And I was not given the opportunity to write about the ways in which these countries were dealing with these issues on their own terms and having very complex debates within their own societies that had very little to do at times with what people in Washington or in Paris were saying. Africa is not this monolithic reactionary place where there's no hope for sexual minorities. And that was often the perspective that I was pressured to highlight in my reporting. So the book was really a reaction to that and trying to give space for a fuller picture of the story to emerge.
Well, and it ends up playing a key role. It's, I think, one of the central tenets of saying, look, there's all this nuance and complexity that's going on the ground that you don't read in that sort of quick hit daily breaking news journalism, right? That comes out into Western media. Do you keep in touch with any of your protagonists, any of the folks in your book?
Yeah, I do. I would say most closely with the Liberians, because I was there most recently in 2017. Lambert unfortunately passed away right around the time the book was coming out, which was really disheartening. But obviously with other members of the Cameroonian community, I'm in contact. And in Cote d'Ivoire, I go back to Abidjan from time to time, so I'm able to see them in person.
Okay, very good. PJ, how about you? Are you still in touch with the family, or tell me a little bit about kind of what's going on?
Sure, yeah, very much so. And especially with some recent developments, I've been speaking a lot to the family, at least keeping in touch with them and, and interviewing and actually interviewing Attorney Virginia Suarez and some of the activists again, just to kind of get some of their reactions to what's happening as well.
Right. Well, as we end the documentary, it's, kind of one of the big, I don't know, reveals, if that's what it is, here you have this U.S. Marines, the first U.S. soldier convicted, correct? In
Correct.
the Philippines, which was a big deal.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily go as you would think it should go. And you mentioned you have an update, and so tell us what the update is.
Yeah, so, the film ended with Pemberton, the Marine, appealing his conviction, right? So he was sentenced to 6 to 12 years in the national prison, none of it which happened. Instead he remained in jurisdiction of the United States in a military facility of the Philippines. So very confusing, but for me, just another example of kind of neocolonialism, right? There's a Philippine military camp and there's a section of it that's only accessible to US military and high-ranking officials, which is where Pemberton was being held. And he was being held there for several years while he was appealing. And then just this last month in September, he withdrew his appeal, which means he accepted the conviction. He was no longer fighting it. He paid the Laude family some civil damages, and then simultaneously filed a motion to be released early for good conduct. Good conduct time allowance is officially what was requested, which was granted by the regional court who originally sentenced him. And this, as you can imagine, was a travesty for the Laude family and for those in support of, Jennifer's case. And the Laude family appealed it. Even the Duterte administration, Department of Justice, questioned the calculation of the good conduct time allowance. Other things that made it very complicated was that supposedly good conduct time allowance had been suspended for the last year, yet it was being applied to a US Marine, even though that policy had been officially suspended by the administration. But regardless, while all of that was happening, Duterte gave the Marine Pemberton an absolute pardon, which doesn't mean it erases the conviction, it just pardons him from any further sentencing.
But
so with that,
he's free.
Yes. So with that, on September 13th, Pemberton left the Philippines and flew back to the United States on a military plane. And what I'll also say is this was a huge deal because since the trial itself, Pemberton had not been seen. And so there was a lot of concerns that he might not even be in the country. He might have been removed. The Laude family and a lot of the activists asked to even see the conditions that he was being held in or even proof that he was there. And they were always denied any of those requests. So for me, from a filmmaking perspective, and as someone who's been following the story, I do think there's a lot of significance in the fact that Pemberton was seen twice, once going to a pre-trial, the second time going to the sentencing and leaving, and then never seen again until he's at an airport boarding a plane to go back to the United States. Meanwhile, my film follows 3+ years of the Laude family really fighting over holding the Marine accountable. And so a lot of people are left questioning whether or not any justice was served, right? In terms of if he didn't serve any sentence at all, because a lot of people are not considering that whatever time was spent waiting for his appeal, he was not formally incarcerated, but clearly that argument is being not taken by both sides of the government, both the United States and the Philippines. So anyway, he's flown back to the United States. From my understanding, he flew into Hawaii. He's not going to be court-martialed. It's, there's still a question on if he's going to be, if he's going to remain in the military or not. There's an assumption that he won't, but you know, as I've learned following the story, there's lots of twists and turns and surprises, so you never know, especially under a Trump administration, you also don't know. But one thing I will say is there was a very strong reaction to this absolute pardon, not only in the Philippines, but also in the United States. And so from my understanding, when Pemberton landed, there was also a group of women, right? A lot of Filipino women and trans women who protested Pemberton's release. So, so for me, the story is not over. My film might be over, but the story continues. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, we're running out of time, but I want to give you both a chance just to talk really quickly about kind of what's next. And you know, PJ, I know you mentioned you are talking to family. There may be I don't want to say part 2, but there may be an epilogue or something with this story. And I know you have other work as well that's coming to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm always interested in, you know, as I mentioned, stories from the LGBTQ plus community in the Philippines, and I have a lot of shorter serial projects that I'm making right now. You know, one project I'll just tell you a little bit about was I'm working with a collective of artists, of 80 artists, and what we've done is we've sky typed, like using sky typers, like, you know, planes that write messages in the sky. We sky typed messages of hope and resistance and poetry over centers of immigrant detention here in the United States, in protest of immigrant detention policies and the culture of incarceration. So that's something that I'm kind of working on right now.
Neat. Wow. All right. Robbie, how about you? It's what's next, or what are you just working on now?
Sure. So I am working for AFP, the French news agency here in Addis, covering Ethiopia, which is going through a very fraught and turbulent democratic transition after Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. You may recall he won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, and gearing up for elections that are supposed to happen at some point in 2021. So that has very, very little to do, subject matter-wise, with the book, but is a pretty all-consuming story. And then I also cover the African Union from here, which is interesting in terms of LGBTQ issues, because it gives me more of an opportunity to take a Pan-African look at how these issues are playing out and what leaders are saying and how their positions are evolving, rather than zeroing in on individual countries. So it's certainly a different approach, but interesting in various ways.
I got you. Do you think you have another book in you?
At the moment, I think it is possible that I will write another book one day, but I have no idea what it would be about. So
it's impressive you did one. So
thank you.
So very good. I know we're running a little late, so I appreciate everyone's patience. And Robbie and PJ, I really appreciate you both joining us today and putting up with my questions and also talking a bit about your work and process and sort of how you develop things. So let me thank you both, PJ Raval, Robbie Corey-Boulet. As I mentioned in the chat, we have links to their work. I strongly encourage you to look them up because it's great and it's fascinating and insightful. So they've shared their insight and experience with us, and I appreciate it. So my thanks to everyone joining us today. NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, will continue to host additional webinars that highlight the contributions and great work of our Excellence in Journalism Award winners. So everyone, please stay tuned. Look for more information. We'll get it out, and we'll also put it up on nlgja.org. So we appreciate you. Thank you. And I want to say goodbye, everyone. PJ, Robbie, it was great talking with you.
Thanks so much.
All right, take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Cheers.